The year is 1187. The unthinkable has happened. The Crusader kingdom is dead. A sultan named Saladin has done what was impossible for 80 years. He has crushed the Christian armies, captured the true cross, and taken back the holy city of Jerusalem. The West has been kicked out of the East. When this news reached Europe, it didn't just cause panic. It caused an apocalypse. The Pope died of shock. Kings stopped eating. The Christian world realized that the armies of the past were too weak to fight Saladin. They didn't need another politician. They didn't need a diplomat. They needed a monster. And in the cold north, a monster was waking up. His name was Richard Plantagenet, but history remembers him as the Lionheart. He was the king of England, but he barely set foot in his own country. He didn't care about laws or taxes or his people. He only cared about war. To retake Jerusalem, he needed an army that money couldn't buy. So he bankrupted his own empire to build it. He famously said, "I would sell London itself if I could find a buyer." He sold everything. He built a fleet of iron and wood, and he sailed east to kill a legend. He arrived at the port city of Acre. It was a meat grinder. The Christians had been besieging it for 2 years, rotting in the trenches. When Richard arrived, he was dying. Scurvy and fever were eating him alive. But the man was too angry to die. He had himself carried to the front lines on a silk stretcher, holding a crossbow, picking off defenders on the walls between bouts of vomiting. Within 5 weeks, the city that held out for 2 years cracked open. But taking the city wasn't enough. Saladin delayed the ransom payment. He was testing the new king, trying to see if Richard had patience. He didn't. Richard ordered 2,700 Muslim prisoners marched out of the city gates. In full view of Saladin's distant army, he had them all butchered. Saladin had shown mercy at Jerusalem. Richard showed the world that the rules had changed. The war was now total. Richard began the long march south toward Jerusalem, and Saladin did exactly what he did at Hattin. He shadowed them. For 70 miles, it was a nightmare. Saladin's archers swarmed the Crusader column like wasps. They fired millions of arrows, trying to goad the heavy knights into breaking formation. They tried to bait them into the desert to die of thirst. But Richard wasn't a fool. He forced his men to march in strict formation. The discipline was agonizing. Men were dying in the heat, arrows bouncing off their shields, begging to charge. Richard beat them back into line. He knew that if they broke, they died. Until they reached the forest of Asruf. The pressure became too much. The Hospitaller knights at the rear could not take the insults anymore. They broke ranks. They charged Saladin's lines without orders. It should have been a disaster. It should have been another Hattin. But Richard saw the moment. He realized there was no turning back. If they were going to charge, they would all charge. He blew the horn, and he unleashed the full weight of Europe's iron armor. Saladin's army was built for speed, not weight. They were light cavalry designed to harass, not to take a direct hit from a heavy lance charge. When the Crusader wall of iron smashed into them, Saladin's lines didn't just break, they evaporated. The Sultan himself barely escaped capture. For the first time in decades, the myth of Saladin's invincibility was shattered. The unstoppable force had finally met the immovable object. Richard had won the battle, but he couldn't win the war. He marched within 12 miles of Jerusalem. He could see the holy city. He could see the Dome of the Rock, but he never attacked it. He realized a hard truth. He could take the city, but he couldn't keep it. Most of his soldiers would go home after the victory, and Saladin would just take it back in a month. So the two monsters did something unexpected. They talked. Richard and Saladin never met face to face, but they exchanged gifts. When Richard fell ill, Saladin sent him fresh fruit and snow from the mountains to cool his fever. When Richard's horse was killed in battle, Saladin sent him 2 new Arabian stallions because, as he said, a king should not be on foot. They respected each other more than they respected their own allies. In 1192, they signed the Treaty of Jaffa. Jerusalem would stay under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims would be allowed to visit freely and safely. The crusade ended not with a bang, but with a handshake. Richard sailed home to a Europe that would eventually imprison him. And Saladin, the man who conquered the East? Shortly after Richard left, Saladin fell ill. He was 55 years old. He had spent his entire life in the saddle, fighting for God. When the great Sultan died, his servants went to open his private treasury to pay for his funeral. They expected to find mountains of gold. They found nothing. There was 1 piece of gold and 40 pieces of silver. It wasn't even enough to buy the dust to cover his grave. He had given it all away, to the poor, to his soldiers, to his enemies. He had conquered the world, but he left it with empty hands. The Lionheart was remembered as a warrior, but Saladin was remembered as a king.